Messa is an unhinged and better looking single target physical DPS unit coming to Persona 5 the Phantom X Global. He is the only other physical DPS unit behind Skull and has 2 different forms with 2 different playstyles. He excels at DOT type damage in his Hunter form and can deal a lot of burst damage in his Executioner form. Because of this, he is a very good generic DPS unit that will cover most type of content in the game and is very flexible when it comes to building him along with his best teams. In this video, I will be going over his skills, skill rotations, skill priorities, best weapons, best revelation card sets, wonder personas to use with him, best teams, and then vertical investment in awarenesses. So welcome to the complete guide to Kira Kitazato, also known as Messa. Messa's kit is unique in that it has 2 distinct playstyles built in, and both of which can be used in tandem together or separate depending on the builds and teams you set up. Messa is an attack scaling physical DPS unit, and his innate A0 gives him access to 2 different forms known as Hunter and Executioner, with each form having different skills. Messa will always start in his Hunter form when entering battle. With Hunter, after dealing damage with a skill, there is a 65% base chance to inflict the target with 1 bleed stack, and these bleed stacks will transfer to the highest HP unit when an enemy with bleed is defeated. This passive triggers in addition to the bleed stacks that are generated by his skills. Therefore, you have a chance of inflicting up to 2 bleed stacks every time Messa uses a skill. More on that in the skill section later. Bleed is a DOT status effect which triggers at the end of each turn. Bleed does all multi-type damage equal to 1% of the enemy's max HP plus 4% of Messa's attack as physical damage for 4 turns with a maximum of 10 bleed stacks possible on each enemy. The reason why all multi-type damage is pretty good is because it ignores resistances and nulls of enemies. With his Executioner form, when using his skills, for every 3 bleed stacks on the target, Messa will do an additional instance of physical damage known as laceration damage. His 2 different forms also use different resources. His Hunter form uses SP, while his Executioner form uses his HP. Okay, so let's go over his Hunter form skills first. Skill 1, known as Incision Technique, deals physical damage to one enemy 4 times and inflicts 1 bleed stack. This is in addition to the 65% base chance to inflict the target with 1 bleed stack from his A0 passive. Skill 2, Lethal Pleasure, deals physical damage to one enemy 2 times and immediately triggers all bleed based damage and refreshes the duration of bleed. Skill 3 is Knight's Arrival, which can only be triggered when an enemy has 7 or more bleed stacks. Messa will transform into the Executioner. This will change all his skills to the Executioner form and gains the laceration effect from his A0 passive, the one where he deals an additional instance of physical damage for every 3 bleed stacks on the target. You are still able to use an Executioner skill after this form change, though it isn't like you take a turn to change form and attack on the next turn. You can also just press the Alt button if you're on PC, for example, to change forms. You don't have to use the skill in that regard. It essentially does the same thing. At the end of the turn, Messa will transform back into his Hunter form. So in his Executioner's form, his skill 1 turns into Sinful Game, which deals physical damage to one enemy and removes 2 bleed stacks. Skill 2, Curtain Call, deals physical damage to one enemy, and for each bleed stack on the target, increases the skill and laceration damage by 2% and removes all bleed stacks. Both his skill 1 and 2 can proc the laceration bonus damage from his A0 passive. Messa's highlight is actually universal between both forms and makes him transform into his Hunter form and immediately add 5 bleed stacks to the target and then immediately transform into his Executioner form and deals the physical damage. The highlight can proc both instances of the passive in either Hunter or Executioner form. And of course, Messa's 2 Ascension passives include Infest. For each 30% effect hit rate, increases bleed damage multiplied by 4% on Messa's attack up to 90%, EHR, and his other passive is called Fester, which increases EHR by 36% in Hunter form and penetration by 21% in Executioner form. So his kit is essentially centered around applying bleed stacks and then using those bleed stacks to deal massive damage. All instances of bleed damage is considered almighty, whereas everything else is considered physical. So as long as the enemy doesn't resist physical, in terms of just without, the bleed stacks obviously, or the bleed damage, then Messa is a very, very good DPS unit for most content. Now I know this kit sounds quite involved, but honestly it's really simple and makes for some fun and unique playstyles. If you want to, you can actually stay permanently in Hunter form and just bleed the enemy to death, with multiple bleed stacks and instances of damage. A great team for this pairing is actually with Sumamoko, or even Sepia actually, which can increase EHR and do follow-up dot damage respectively. If you are going to play this style, however, then your skill rotation is very simple. We're trying to get as many bleed stacks on the enemy as possible with skill 1 and highlight with max stacks at 10. And then once you have max stacks at 10, trigger all stacks at once with skill 2, refreshing the bleed duration, as well as doing a buttload of damage. Now if you want to play him as a more traditional physical DPS carry, then it's the same process as Hunter, but as soon as you reach 10 bleed stacks, you want to use skill 3 instead of skill 2 to transform into the Executioner and start using skill 1 to continuously proc the laceration damage, while also removing 3 bleed stacks. Or you can merely proc and increase the laceration and skill damage by using skill 2, Curtain Call, to do a crap ton of burst physical damage, and then reapply all those bleed stacks again when you transform back into the Hunter. In all honesty, either playstyle works fine, but the physical DPS carry with Executioner is definitely more consistent and just feels a bit better to play overall. You'll see a lot of people in the endgame be using this form anyway, because the dot form, or the DOT effect with the DOT team, is a little bit clunky to play. Overall, DOT is a weird team comp in this game. It doesn't really work as well or as well defined like in games like Honkai Star Rail, for example. It is a little bit gimmicky in Persona 5 Phantom X. So switching between the two forms is the best way to get the most out of Messa and to do the most damage. As for his skill priorities, you want to level up skill 3, then skill 1, which is your bread and butter skill for applying bleed and dealing laceration damage in both Hunter and Execution forms, and then of course skill 2 into Highlight to round out the kit. As with all weapons in P5X, Messa's signature weapon, Bloodletter, will be his best in slot weapon, giving him more attack, penetration, and damage dealt. And with the global buffs, it now also gives 15% effect hit rate. Obviously, you do have the added pen and damage dealt, but the additional EHR is the biggest buff to Messa in my opinion. This makes it so that you have an 85% base chance to inflict bleed with A0 passive buffed as well. This compared to his next best, which is his 4-star Undying Embers, where it only gives attack bonuses. As Messa is an attack scaling DPS, if we compare both at Forge rank 0, the base attack bonus is 30% with his signature and 12% with his 4-star plus 1.8% permanent in battle increase for each bleed stack up to 10, so another 18% for a total of 30%. At max Forge rank, however, for his 4-star, the amount of attack is actually higher. This makes his 4-star option really viable, especially if you don't want to pull for his weapon or don't have enough pulls to. But just judging based on the global buffs, then his signature weapon is definitely a go-to pull, especially if you really like Messa. His next best option after his 5 and 4 stars will be his 3-star option that you can buy, but it gives nowhere near as much attack and bonuses as his signature or 4-star, and I don't really recommend him, and to be honest, you will be losing out on a lot of damage. Messa's best set is by far the Wisdom Space card paired with the 4-piece Oppression set. The Oppression set for the 2-piece set bonus gives Messa 10% physical damage increase, and the 4-piece gives him access to Malice stacks, which after every hit of skill damage increases attack by 5% for 2 turns up to 6 stacks. The Oppression plus Wisdom Space card bonus effect gives a flat 20% physical damage and EHR increase, making it more likely to inflict additional bleed stack to do more damage. For your main stats, all you really want is attack, attack, attack. All you want is attack percent on all cards, and for substats you do want a lot of EHR, penetration, damage bonus, and then attack. For stat breakpoints you can follow the in-game guide, but it's very important to have at least 90% plus EHR in battle in order to consistently apply bleed stacks, which is basically the bread and butter of Messa's kit. Otherwise he can feel a bit clunky to play, or at least a bit slow, with having to stack bleed over a longer term period, and relying on RNG to apply stacks quick enough. For one of his personas, anything that can increase EHR or attack will be good for Messa. Now the best in slot persona would be Lilith from the exchange shop, which at Instinct 0 gives a flat 29.1% attack increase, and after using Lilith's skill 1 Killer Allure, you can get a bonus attribute damage and greatly increased skill damage, both of which count towards his bleed stack damage and overall physical DPS. Lilith also gives an additional 10% pen as well. Now other personas like Komokten work really well with bonus EHR, and typical attack increasing personas like Dio, Dominion, and even Yannisik can work. Basically anyone who can increase Messa's attack. You would definitely want to go for skills like Tarakaja, Matarakaja, skills like that. Messa can work decently okay with crit based buffs, but again all his skills are attack scaling, so make sure he gets as much attack as possible in battle, and as long as you're hitting that breakpoint at 9% EHR, you'll be very consistent with that, and then any additional increase in attack will be increase in additional bonus damage. Now here's the interesting part about Messa's build guide, and that is his teams, because he can have a lot of different teams depending on each different playstyle that he has. So actually for a pure DOT team, you can actually use units like Sepia. Sepia can be used as sort of like a sub DPS role because he can provide cursed DOT damage, follow up, and even Almighty damage as well. Another good teammate is the recently released Seaside Tomoko, as she can increase attack and EHR, and also provide follow up damage, healing, and increase in max HP. For your Navigator unit, anyone of Okyan or Win will work, basically anyone who busts attack, but Futaba will definitely be the best Navi when she comes out on Global, which should be the patch after Messa's. Both navies increase attack, but Wind also does provide other utility such as Def Down, as well as damage increase with her insight stacks. Now, the units that I just talked about can also be used for his executioner playstyle as well, as they provide pretty much all the same necessary stats that Messa needs to shine. However, Sepia loses a lot of value, especially if you're playing anything but like DOT, I guess, and should be replaced definitely with Chord. Actually, just on Chord, you can really just replace Chord with any sort of attack or buffing unit. You can even use Riddle in this instance, especially if you never really got Chord for some reason, because Chord is one of the best supports in the game. And also, if you never pulled for Seaside Tomoko, you can definitely use Marion, because Marion pretty much provides the exact same healing capabilities, just minus the effect hit rate. You definitely do want to try and run some sort of healer with Messa, just because of the HP that he uses within his executioner form, and over time it does stack up a lot, and he will tend to die if you don't actually have a healer. You can also use general debuffing units as well. Vino works really well, as well as Rin, and these debuffing units actually work especially well with a vertically invested Messa, which we'll be going over in the awareness section next. So essentially his team comps are quite flexible. All you really need is a healer and any sort of buffing unit, and any units that buff Messa's attack in order to get the most out of his kit. Now in my opinion, vertical investment for Messa is kind of bait and really isn't worth it unless you really do like the unit. Now at A1, the first time you deal skill damage to an enemy, you can additionally inflict 5 bleed stacks, and when in executioner form, when using skills, increases damage by 8% for each debuff up to 10 debuffs. Now with the global buffs as well for your A1, it now gives an additional 1.5 times Almighty Bleed multiplier as well. This makes the A1 a perfect stopping point, as it makes Messa into a more consistent unit that can get online immediately, rather than building up slowly with the bleed stacks. You can pretty much get online on turn 1 rather than turn 2. It also makes his team comps a bit more flexible, as I mentioned before, able to use debuffers such as Reno, Rin for example, instead of a sub DPS or a buffer role. And obviously you do have more damage output now with the 1.5 times Almighty Bleed multiplier, which is actually a massive change, so if you really do like Messa, then A1 is great. A2 increases laceration damage and now heals Messa, but the heal is kinda negligible, especially if you are using healing units like some of Moko or Marion. A3 and 5 give skill ups, A4 increases highlight damage, and A6 increases the number of bleed stacks to 13, and enemies will always have at least 3 of them. In executioner form at A6, using skill 1 will no longer remove bleed, and upgrades laceration to execution, which increases damage and deals 50% of that damage to all enemies rather than single target. So if you do really want to invest in Messa and you do want to pull for him, then I highly recommend that you get his signature weapon first for the additional effect hit rate from the global buffs, and then definitely go for A1. A1 W0 Messa is definitely really good. His next best starting point is obviously his A6, but that's going to cost a lot, and unless you really like the unit, I highly don't recommend doing that whatsoever. And in terms of investment in general, if you do have a pretty well built up Ryuji, then Messa in general probably isn't all that you need to consider, especially considering that Futaba is right around the corner. So now this is the showcase for Messa, and this showcase was recorded live during one of my live streams, so definitely subscribe and stay tuned. Now, in my opinion, Messa is a very fun unit and a very good physical DPS unit. Now, should you pull for Messa? Not necessarily, and I would probably say no, especially if you do have an A1 or an A2 Ryuji. And if you have higher dupes of Ryuji, especially for A4, A5, A6 for example, then you definitely don't need to pull for Kira at all, especially if you're only going for meta and you're only going for the physical DPS aspect. This is because in a properly set up Ryuji team, Ryuji can actually do a lot more burst damage than Messa. Messa does require specific-ish teams, and it does also require a healer in order to keep up with his executioner form HP usage. And every time you are using a healer that's not really debuffing or buffing a certain unit, DPS, and or just def downing the enemy for example, then you are losing out on buff time and debuff uptime. I do think he is really fun to play. I think his animations look great, and I think his design overall is awesome. I do hope that they buffed him a little bit more on global, if I'm being completely honest, but I guess those are the buffs that have come out. And because those buffs don't really push him up into the upper echelons, especially, compared to Ryuji for example, especially, your higher dupes of Ryuji, then considering all that with Futaba right around the corner, would I recommend using your pulls, especially if you're an F2P player? Definitely not. But if you do enjoy Messa, and then, you're pulling for whoever you really want to pull and the characters that you want, then Messa is a great pickup, hence why I pulled him. So hopefully you enjoyed the complete guide to Messa. If you did, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe on the video. I will be doing more Persona 5 the Phantom X guide content, so definitely stay tuned. Thanks for watching, everyone. Enjoy the showcase. I'll catch you guys in the next video.
この程度で物足りん。
ハルピューヤ実験の邪魔をするな。
どうですか？梅の花時、今。さてどうしようかしら。戦術支援発動。
礼を言っておく。
暑さを鎮めよう。フラッシュムラ、海風に乗せてみんなに届け。
ハルピューヤ
くら
私も忙しいんですけど。
海風に乗せてみんなに届け。本番だよ、カリオペ。これが私の全力の
ヘルソラーリリス、これでどうだ。
この程度で物足りん。
来いハルピューヤ実験の邪魔をするな。
海風に乗せてみんなに届け。
どうですか？
夏日に負けない。フラッシュムラザパーンなんてね。カリオペ、聴いてほしいこの歌を。
ヘルソラーディオニソスいただいていく。
ハイライト発動可能よ。
この程度で物足りん。
ハルピューヤ実験の邪魔をするな。
海風に乗せてみんなに届け。
どうですか？梅の花時、今。さてどうしようかしら。さてどうしようかしら。戦術支援発動。
フラッシュムラ、海風に乗せてみんなに届け。カリオペ、響き渡れどこまでも。
ハルピューヤ
くら
海風に乗せてみんなに届け。
ヘルソラーヤノシークこれでどうだ。
かき回して強め。調子が悪いよね。無理はしないで。
物足りん。
来いハルピューヤ実験の邪魔をするな。
どうですか？どうですか？準備完了よ。合図をお願いワンダ。さてどうしようかしら。戦術支援発動。
礼を言って
夏日に負けない。フラッシャーパーンなんてね。
ハイライト発動可能よ。
この鼓動を歌に乗せてカリオペ、カリオペ。いい歌を届けよう。これが私の全力の歌。
ヘルソラーリリスディオニソス待てよ。ヘルソラヤノシーク リリス受けてみろ。
海風に乗せてみんなに届け。
この程度で物足りん。
ハルピューヤ貴様を実験体にしてやろう。
海風に乗せてみんなに届け。